So the two met on January the 30th of 1876 in a little building in Chicago called the 2nd Regiment Armory. The 2nd Regiment Armory was mentioned on television yesterday because 97 years ago yesterday there was a boat that tipped over in the Chicago River. It was an overloaded boat. It tipped over. They used the 2nd Regiment Armory as a morgue, and supposedly the whole area is haunted now. The 2nd Regiment Armory is still there today. You know it as Oprah Winfrey Studios. These two lined up for a 6-day walk. All the papers, it was really close, going back and forth for 4 days. After 4.5 days, all the papers came out and said, it's close, but Bertha von Hillern's going to win because she just looks better, she's walking faster, she's not having nearly the problems that Mae Marshall had. As a matter of fact, her feet were so battered that they were swollen.
Now you have to understand, both these women were pretty desperate, especially Mae Marshall. She was in her mid-30s and she didn't really have a lot going for her, whereas you had this German immigrant, she could go back to doing whatever, but you know, the hometown girl, and that's how he pegged this, was this is the German Fraulein versus the American girl. And they dressed up the 2nd Regiment Armory. They had German bunting everywhere, and they had American flags. And so this whole sense of nationalism, which was a huge deal back then, especially against the Germans, was played up very big. So for 4 or 5 days, the crowds were very pro Mae Marshall, and they had huge amounts of money bet on her winning. So there were amateur and professional gamblers, and gambling was a huge catalyst in all of this. It was one of the areas that kind of surprised me in that how much it convinced me all of this really happened. Because when I started, I wasn't even sure. I said, this had to be a fraud. There's no way that a person could do this. But when you had the reporters logging all of the quarter miles and mile splits, and when you had the judges there making tallies every time they finished a lap, and when you had the gamblers watching all of the time to make sure that everything was on the up and up, because in this sport most of the time it wasn't. There was lots of fraud. These tracks were very small. The one in Chicago measured 10 laps to the mile. So if you think about your average quarter-mile track around their high school, 4 laps to a mile, this is 10 laps to the mile. So these tracks were very small, and the venues were very small. The one 2nd Regiment Armory held 3,000 people, and that was packed. And it started out, they had a fairly good number of people there, but as time went on, the place was just jammed.
There were 3,000 people in this arena. Bertha von Hillern, being from Germany, was not the favorite. Mae Marshall, the local girl, was the favorite. This track measured 10 laps to the mile. So they had to write down these numbers really quick.
And the race was really good for about 4 or 5 days. All the papers were pretty convinced after the 5th day that Bertha von Hillern was going to win. She had a small lead, varied 3, 4, 5 miles, but she was not having nearly the physical problems that Mae Marshall was having. They came up on the 5th day, and all the papers said that Bertha von Hillern was going to win. Well, this didn't sit very well with the gamblers who had all their money staked on Mae Marshall. And so Mae Marshall went into her tent, and she was gone for a couple of hours. And she came out, and this was just a few hours to go, she came out just suddenly rejuvenated. No one knows what happened, but somehow she found a spark. And she kept lapping Bertha von Hillern over and over again. Well, this just sent the crowd, this very pro-Mae Marshall crowd, into a frenzy because everybody said she's going to get beat. Now here it is hours out, and she starts lapping Bertha von Hillern, who kept this same plodding style that had worked really well for 5 days. And as it got closer to the finish, the gamblers got up and started making their way toward the judges' stand. And this happened very slowly, but then it started building, and you had more and more people jammed down at the judge's stand, and it created chaos down there.
And they created all kinds of confusion, and this pandemonium just started growing within the confines of the 2nd Regiment Armory. It turned almost into a mob. Meanwhile, the walkers are still down there. Nobody's paying any attention to them anymore because everyone's lost track of exactly where everyone was. And the judges got scared.
Because if they're covering a lap, if they're covering 10 laps to the mile, you have to be constant in your diligence because they're coming by like every 45 seconds, something like that. And so you have to make sure and tally, and they created confusion. They said, oh, well, you didn't count this lap, or you didn't count that lap, or you counted double on that one. And so all these judges, they could no longer use the big tote board because they couldn't get to it. So they started going to their own notepads, which of course is going to be a disaster. And as time went on and more people went down there, it created this really surreal situation because all of the attention went towards what was going on at the judge's stand, and it just morphed into a mob. Meanwhile, the women were still walking, and no one had any idea what was going on anymore.
Judges were fearing for their lives. So what happened, they just kind of looked at each other and said, we're going to come to a gentleman's agreement here, and we're going to determine that Mae Marshall walked 233 miles, Bertha von Hillern walked 231. Declared her the winner, and she came away with $500, and Bertha von Hillern popped a cork because she felt she had been robbed. And she said, I will take on Mae Marshall anytime, any place, but not here, because you think because I'm a teenager, she was only 18, you think because I'm a teenager and I don't know what went on here, you think because I don't speak the language very well, I know exactly what happened. I can't get a fair shake here, but I'll take on Mae Marshall anytime, any place, but not in Chicago.
They finished, and Mae Marshall was taken into a room. She was so far gone. The newspaper said that as a matter of fact, her feet were swollen to twice their normal size and looked like hamburger meat. She had actually taken off her shoes and put on a pair of O'Leary shoes, and their feet got too swollen for that. She had to take off those shoes, and she was walking in stocking feet, and her shoes were just red with blood. I mean, her socks were just red with blood. Somehow she got through this because she just had to. And she was taken in, borderline unconscious. Even one of the papers said she was victorious, but if she survived, she is set for life because she was going to win all this money.
11 months later, they met in New York. The final score was Mae Marshall, 281 miles, Bertha von Hillern, 323.
And there was a lot of contentiousness between the two. They didn't like each other. Bertha von Hillern certainly didn't like Mae Marshall because she thought that she'd gotten screwed in that other race. And so there was this big push to have a third race.
And Mae Marshall couldn't wait for that third race because she knew that'd be a big payday. This would determine who the better pedestrian was. And Bertha von Hillern said, basically, I don't need you. In my mind, I have beaten you twice.
She went on a series of individual walks, mostly 100-milers, but not always. Sometimes 24 hours, sometimes, I can't remember if she did a 6-day solo, but she went to Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, Louisville, Kentucky, Cincinnati, and over a 2-year period, she went on these walks, went on these solo efforts, made a mountain of money, was written about in all the papers, absolutely one of the richest women in America, certainly one of the most admired. And she retired at the age of 22, became a really successful landscape painter. She started studying under a man named William Hunt in Boston, who was one of the top landscape artists in America at the time. And she studied under him, and she set up a studio in Strasburg, Virginia. She went to some other places, but she settled there in Strasburg, and she painted there for something like 40 years. And at one point, there was a U.S. Senator. There was a big parade in Strasburg. There was a U.S. Senator, and she rode in the same cart with this U.S. Senator. That's what a big name she was. And she died in 1939. She was 86 years old, something like that, 83, 84 years old when she died. But even in 1926, I found a reference to her in 1926 in the Winchester, Virginia Star, where they'd had a county fair and she had won 3 blue ribbons for baking bread. So, and she was even still famous for walking back then. She would walk to and from church. She was very religious, deep Catholic, and she walked to and from church, and one paper said that it was 11 miles. Mae Marshall became the only walker in America for the next couple of years, and it wasn't going very well for her. She made a tour of the South because without a rival, there's only so much you can do. She started taking on men, and she would, for the most part, beat men, but it was viewed more as a novelty than anything else. And what she needed, she really needed a rival. And the rival, surprisingly, came from England, because the rival was Ada Anderson.